When I was young, why goodness me, I used to dream all day of elephants and crocodiles in places far away. But of all things weird and wonderful, it's very strange but true. Although I love my teddy bear, I like monsters too.
The Secret Life of Dionne P. Nash, Part 4. The Spinosaurus eventually tore through Dionne's force field, though doing so had produced many gruesome wounds all over the animal, to the point where the golden waters went red with its blood. The sail-backed beast didn't seem bothered at all, and let out another massive roar, before bringing one of its huge clawed hands down on Dionne, who only barely managed to evade it. As the animal thrashed around in the water to try and find its small prey, Dionne did all she could to try and conjure up another spell to use against the monster. But not surprisingly, she couldn't focus clearly, having to constantly dodge the dinosaur's bites, and even just its massive body thrashing around. At one point, however, her fear became so great that she unintentionally produced a magical blast. This came just in time for Friage, as the Spinosaurs were about to consume her whole. Unfortunately for Dionne, however, it just drew the animal's attention back to her. Her trusty Gorgonopsid, despite struggling to stay afloat in the water itself, nevertheless came to her aid and bit the side of the Spinosaur's neck. It held on so tightly that when the Spinosaurus reared its head out of the water, the Gorgonopsid was still holding onto its neck. One quick whack from its claws, however, sent the Gorgonopsid crashing back into the water. Still, the beast's distraction had not only bought Dionne enough time to get some distance, but for the shark to return. The Spinosaurus blood that had filled the water, not to mention Dionne's strange and unpredictable magics, had drawn several red sharks to the area beyond the original, which had survived the Spinosaurus's attack. Not being one to back down, the Spinosaurus instantly began to attack the sharks. The sea monsters became engaged in a truly vicious fight, which Dionne could barely make out due to the thrashing and the blood. She was, however, almost hit by one of the dead sharks that was thrown over 20 feet through the air, and that stomach had been sliced open by the Spinosaurus claws. After a few minutes of searching, Dionne found the others, and together they all swam as fast as they could away from the bloodbath ahead, not being sure which of the great beasts had emerged victorious. Another hour or so passed, as the escaped prisoners swam aimlessly through the golden waters. There was some trouble with a curious plesiosaurus, though the Gorgonopsid managed to scare it away. Even though the plesiosaurus was much bigger, like most normal predators, it was not looking for a fight, but an easy meal, and therefore one snap from the Gorgonopsid's mighty jaws to its face when it leaned in close was enough to make the brute think twice, before it sank back beneath the waves. Thankfully, help soon came for Dionne and the others in the unlikely form of the winged, feathered gorillas from Ape Island known as the Tyrak, having been sent by Dionne's old ally, Corlax. The apes had detected Dionne's magical blasts against the sharks and the Spinosaurus from miles away, as had many other great powers, including the vampires themselves. Luckily for Dionne, the apes found her first, and she had no objection to being taken to them, though Mosca did try to resist at first. He was easily overpowered. Upon arriving on Ape Island, Corlax personally greeted Dionne, being somewhat friendlier to her than he had ever been during their alliance. After the former prisoners were given time to recover from their ordeal and to eat and sleep, Corlax told Dionne about what had happened. Sadly, the vampires, after conquering the Sky City, had gone on to take many more important strategic points. Unlike the inhabitants for the Sky City, they had no problem with dropping bombs from above. Even the Sky City's corrupt leaders had not gone that far, out of fear of contaminating areas and causing magical mutations. Even worse, the access they gained to the city's studies on the magics within Dionne, that she had willingly taken part in, allowed the vampires to modify the sample they had extracted from her to create even greater weapons. Many of the largest cities had fallen to the vampires in just a matter of weeks, such as Dynamos, a city that traded dinosaurs and had held out against them for centuries beforehand. These developments were enough to terrify even the apes into breaking their second period of isolation. Corlax, however, also finally revealed the reason the apes had cut themselves off from the war again to Dionne. At the centre of their island, the apes had discovered the greatest concentrated form of the Hylexans' magic that had originally laid waste to the earth. This small sample had become buried underground when the earth was restored, rather than destroyed like the rest of it. The earliest samples of the Hylexan magic that had been discovered years ago had ironically been the spell that Dionne, along with Trian, had originally been sent to the island to retrieve in the first place. However, at that point, even the apes didn't know the full extent of what it was, and those samples had been diluted as well, through exposure to the magics that had rebuilt the earth. The most dangerous and undiluted Hylexan magic that had been buried deep, the apes did not want unleashed. They feared that their island would first be made into more of a target by the humans and the vampires to harness the magic, and that the humans would not only be reckless in using it against the vampires, but each other, and that it would destroy the earth a second time. To be fair, the apes didn't even trust their own to have knowledge of it, and for a long while it was kept secret, except for a tiny elite. Now that the vampires, however, were almost on their doorstep, they knew that it was better to side with the humans. But even here, Corlax was still mistrustful of the humans, that is, except for Dionne. Part of the reason that Corlax trusted Dionne, it must be said, was because she was not of this time, and therefore lacked any true loyalty to any individual city or settlement, like almost everyone else did. From a practical point of view, there was also the possibility of her going back to her own era, taking any secrets with her. Finally, due to the unusual nature of her powers, she could potentially use a sample of the Hylexans' magic to cripple the vampire's defences around the Sky City and pass it off as her own powers. Dionne was still reluctant, however, to help unleash such a devastating weapon, and at one point, along with Friage and Mosca and her Gorgonopsid, she even attempted to flee the apes' island, though her attempt was stopped not by the apes, but a horde of Caradon soldiers from the ocean. These monsters had been drawn by the trail of magic left behind by Dionne to the island, and had been waiting for the right moment to strike, knowing that they could never take the island itself. Dionne once again was able to conjure up magics to hold the Caradons off long enough for the apes to show up to fight the Sharkmen. Though the Caradons were ultimately driven off, 16 of the Havia were killed in the process. Corlax was furious with Dionne. Had she not been a time traveller, he would have surely killed her, in fact. Instead, however, he was able to use Dionne's guilt over the deaths of the Havia to convince her that she owed it to him and the rest of the island to protect them from the vampires, which she reluctantly agreed to. To this day, however, while she knows it was the right thing to fight back against the vampires, she still wished she hadn't been so weak in giving in to Corlax. The horrors that would be unleashed by her guilt endured for many centuries to come. Dionne trained for a few more weeks to try and harness her powers. It didn't take her long to realise that it was her emotions that were controlling the magics inside her. She thought back to all she had endured in the camps, seeing the man she loved, even her beloved pet, being degraded and humiliated, as well as all of the innocent people the vampire's king had killed in front of her. She thought about ripping the king to pieces, about burning all of the vampires' repulsive, frail bodies into nothing but ash, and the rage as well as ecstasy of that made her magic so powerful that on her first test alone she fired a blast strong enough to rip through a mountain. Some of the apes even argued that with Dionne they didn't need to use the Hylexan's magic, but ultimately Corlax believed that it was a safer bet, as Dionne's magics were still unpredictable. Friage and Mosca, meanwhile, were sent to live in one of the few settlements that was still safe from the vampires, where he would be reunited with his wife and children. Sadly, however, Friage, it seemed, had been left completely broken during the ordeal, and said barely anything to Mosca. Dionne never met Mosca again, and like I said before, it would be one of her biggest regrets that she would not be able to make peace with him. After gaining control of her magics to some extent, Dionne flew to the Sky City in a force field and deposited the sample of the Hylexan's magics. In an instant, it wiped out the main defences around the city, allowing the apes to launch a full-scale attack. Almost all species of the apes took part in the fight. Dionne, meanwhile, at first could only stare down in horror at what she had unleashed. Normally she had no problem with killing vampires. From the very first time she had killed them, ironically during another attack against the Sky City, she had never seen them as humans. However, the way in which this dark magic tore the demons apart, it wasn't just their bodies that were destroyed, but their very essence. Somehow Dionne could literally see their souls being ripped to pieces. She couldn't describe it to me, but she just knew that was what she was looking at, and it was enough to make her retch. For a few minutes afterwards, she just floated there, almost numb to the war zone below her. Vampires and apes tearing each other apart, giant gorillas battling the dinosaurs that the vampires had managed to control and tame into being beasts of burden. Her Gorgonopsid, which was being ridden by none other than Corlax himself, also took part in the battle and killed many vampires. Eventually, however, as the magics keeping her afloat began to fade, Dionne mustered up her old rage, and actually the prospect of seeing the king die like the soldiers began to excite her. With her magics, Dionne easily ploughed through several of the vampires and even managed to knock a few dinosaurs off their feet, including an Allosaurus. She definitely, even with her magics, would not have been powerful enough to make her way through them all alone, but fortunately the apes occupied most of the vampires' attention. True to form, the king, Jakarian, was getting ready to flee on the other side of the city. As soon as the fight began to look fair, the monster naturally didn't want to be part of it. Just before his departure, however, the king ordered that all the weapons be fired below. Doing so was a risk that not even the vampires were willing to take at this point, as that amount of dark and unknown magic could permanently contaminate the land of Teiros below, even for the vampires themselves. Jakarian, however, did not care. He wanted to send a message to the humans what would happen if they tried anything like this again. Dionne, however, also believes that it may have been because he knew she was going to kill him and wanted, much like before, to take the entire earth down with him. Dionne stopped the cowardly king's craft just as it was about to escape the city and sent it crashing through several buildings. When the king emerged from his craft, however, he was not completely helpless. He held a young girl, no older than 13, by the neck and threatened to rip her heart out if Dionne did not let him go. Years later, Dionne told me that was the hardest moment of her life, to fight the urge to just tear the king apart, regardless of whether he could kill the girl in time or not. She told me that she had always tried to convince herself that it was the magic that was compelling her to not care about the girl, but deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Thankfully, Dionne's better side won out, though as soon as she let her guard down, the king's guards instantly began to attack her. They struck Dionne with magical ropes that had what looked like knives on the end of them. Each one cut straight through her, though they did not, despite appearances, cut through her flesh. They were spiritual knives, which would pierce a person's soul, only causing greater pain. These weapons had ironically been created from the very magics in Dionne herself. The vampires used the ropes to pull Dionne to the ground and proceeded to whip her with them. The pain was greater than anything she had even felt in the camp, and as she lay there too weak to barely fight back, the king became cocky and even started to kick Dionne, breaking her ribs and then standing on her hand until it snapped. He also spat in her face several times too. Sadly, the apes, and even Dionne's pet Gorgonopsid, were too preoccupied with the vampires, who, despite the apes' weapons, still had the upper hand. As the vampires stabbed their knives into her once more, however, Dionne this time used the pain and the anger it caused to power herself up. She sent the darkest, most powerful magics in her body through the blades and the ropes they were attached to into each vampire that was holding it, causing them all to burn away into nothing but ash. With the magic now producing a golden glow that surrounded her entire body to such an extent that almost every fighting creature in the city was distracted by her, even just for a moment, Dionne rose over 30 foot in the air to confront the king, who again hid behind the girl, like the wretched coward he was. "I'll kill her if you move an inch," he said through trembling teeth. Dionne, however, was completely silent for a few seconds, before the king suddenly felt a great surge of pain run through his body, enough to drop him to his knees, allowing the girl to escape. "That's okay. I don't need to move to kill you," Dionne said calmly. She had finally mastered control of her magic in such a way that could never be accomplished through training. This was her hatred, her fear, but also even just her confidence, to not give in to this dark power, to master it, finally coming together to give her complete control. Ironically, it had only been through the king's cowardly attempts to hide behind a girl that Dionne had gained that confidence, as the fact that she had not given in then convinced her that she was stronger than any dark forces in her body. Dionne used her magic to quite literally rip the king from the inside out. She caused his entire body to explode in front of his vile horde. Right to the end, the king pathetically begged for his life, even trying to convince Dionne that Trian was still alive and that he could take her to him. Thankfully, she wasn't fooled. After the king was no more, Dionne turned her attention to the vampire horde, and with a powerful scream and blast of her magic, she sent hundreds of the vampires flying through the air, whilst none of the apes were hurt. The rest of the bloodsuckers, having no idea what she was capable of, all fled as fast as they could. Dionne, however, didn't let them off that easily, and used as much power as she could to destroy hundreds of the vampires and send hundreds more of their ships crashing back down to Earth, where they were vaporized completely before hitting the ground. she also destroyed countless more vampires on the ground below, delivering a devastating defeat to the monsters, the likes of which had never been seen before. The apes that all cheered and started chanting Dionne's name, and her pet ran up to her, with Dionne giving it an affectionate stroke of its mane one last time. Unfortunately, however, Dionne still had the king's weapons to stop. Several of them had already struck the cities they had been sent to. Millions died that day. It was arguably the single most devastating event in the history of our planet since the Hylexans' invasion itself. Had it not been for Dionne, however, hundreds of millions more would have perished. Dionne flew through the air to a couple of 100 feet off the ground, and using her powers was able to stop several of the blasts in the air before they reached their targets. Doing so well as forcing the magics to dissipate until they became harmless took a tremendous amount of power, so much so that it took Dionne, even with her new mastery over magics, several days to completely eliminate the missiles, after which she was left alone almost completely drained of power, and fell back down to earth. Only the tiny leftover residual magics in her body prevented her from dying in the fall, though she still fell into a coma. The survivors of Dynamos found her just a few days later. Dionne was proclaimed the greatest hero Teros had ever seen as a result of her actions, and the surviving cities that grouped together placed her body in a state of magical suspended animation to help her recover. The war, meanwhile, soon entered into its final phase. The devastation inflicted by the king's weapons had changed the face of Teros, making things more difficult for both the humans and the vampires, who had both suffered huge losses. In spite of how difficult things became, Dionne at no point was brought out of her suspended animation, even after her body had healed. Whilst the official reason given was that Dionne was dead, or that she had earned her rest from the conflict. In truth, the leaders of the new alliance were terrified of Dionne, who had, for all intents and purposes, from their point of view, become a goddess. Whilst there were temptations to release and unleash her upon the vampire horde, ultimately none of the heads of the alliance were willing to be forced to bow down to a goddess afterwards. Sadly, despite Korlax's efforts to conceal the nature of the Hylexan magic, a team sent by the human alliance to the ruins of the Sky City discovered samples of it, which they would use to create other weapons of that kind, which in turn forced the vampires to up their use of the black arts. More of Teros' jungles and forests were laid bare, as a result in the final stage of the war, which saw some of the most brutal battles in the planet's history take place. Still, ultimately humanity won out over the vampire horde. What followed the war was anything but a golden age, but at the very least, humanity was finally free from the greatest army of demons that had ever been assembled. At some point after humanity's victory, Dionne was sent backwards in time. She had no idea how she was sent back, but either way, this time she retained her memory of everything that happened in Teros. As far as she was concerned, one moment she was falling from the sky, and the next she was back in her living room, which, from her perspective, she had last been in close to 10 years ago. Her powers were mostly gone. Even after all that time in suspended animation, she had still burnt most of them out fighting against the king's weapons. Adjusting back to 21st century life for Dionne was hard, to say the least. For a long while, she was sure she must have gone insane and dreamed the entire thing. The spell to send her back had also de-aged her in order to make sure that the timeline was not altered. However, Dionne would get proof that it was real every now and again when her powers returned, usually for just a few seconds at a time. To the general public, this would be the time when Dionne began to spiral out of control somewhat. I don't like writing about it. Even already I feel like one of those gutter trash articles, wallowing in her despair and pushing the bullshit tortured artist cliché. Still, it's safe to say that for 2 years, Dionne shunned everyone around her, from her record label to her friends and her family. She'd only make public appearances when she was getting into trouble for something, as she quickly turned to drinking to help block out the pain and the stress that one day her powers could return and change history. In spite of how horrifying Teiros had been, however, she also missed Trian and her pet Gorgonopsid, both of whom she had been denied a chance to properly say goodbye to. Eventually, however, this dark period came to an end, when Dionne was visited by another time traveller, the fourth circus master. The circus masters were a lineage of great heroes who commanded a group of time travellers known simply as the circus family, named so because they travelled through time and space in a magic circus. In actual fact, the tent, as it became known as, was a complex time and space machine constructed by the Vandals when they were in power in Europe. The original circus master was a renegade, reformed Vandal who stole the tent from under them and used it to travel through all of time and space, battling evil wherever he found it. The reason it was called a tent, and for the whole circus motif, was because the mix of different magics used to create it left it with several bright colours, which the first circus master, through some modifications, was able to disguise as a tent. In time, the first circus master assembled a full team of creatures from all over time and space, who became known as his family. The circus master gained his name not just from the fact that he was the leader of the team, but also because he shared a special link with the tent. After the first circus master's death, a successor was chosen by the tent itself, and so on and so on. In total, there were 7 circus masters, all of whom over time recruited different heroes and monsters and creatures to be part of their circus families. The 4th circus master, meanwhile, was a scarecrow brought to life through magic. He was known as Tarkan, and was originally created to protect a small village just outside of Wistman's Woods, a notorious hotspot for supernatural creatures. After it fell, he joined the circus, so to speak, being selected to become its new master. Tarkan was in some ways the most unpredictable circus master. Dionne in particular could get quite annoyed with his childish humour, such as taking his head off and making it fly around and chase people. Dionne's best friend in the circus family, ironically given her nature, was Carlene, a vampire from 1960s London. Carlene, like Dionne, had once been a singer, but was sadly turned into a vampire by a deranged fan who had stalked her in life and wanted to force her to be his vampire bride. After escaping and slaying her insane stalker, Carlene fled to the town of Darrow, where she learned to control her thirst. Working alongside Detective Cushing, she battled many monsters, vampires and creatures in this town, becoming a hero. She later travelled the world, eventually coming to settle in Aviemore in Scotland in the early 21st century. Following the great monster breakout of 2007 in the Highlands, an event which most people would know by the official cover story, the earthquake of 07, Carlene was blasted back through time into the Victorian age by a supernatural force, where she lived for several decades, doing what she always did, fighting evil, until she joined the first iteration of the circus family. Carlene was, by the time of the 4th circus master, the only original member left. As a result, in some respects, the others all deferred to her, including even Tarkan, though ultimately he was still the leader. Dionne naturally clashed with Carlene at first, having trouble believing that a vampire could be anything other than a monster. I must confess that even I found it difficult to believe at first. Vampires, however, are far more complex than you would think initially. It's true that there are hundreds of different species of vampires, all created from the pages of the Book of Castran. All share a number of traits, such as a need to consume the blood of natural creatures, immortality, etc. Still, overall, all vampire species can be grouped into 4 different categories: soul vampires, pure vampires, born vampires, and savage vampires. The differences between these categories is entirely down to how each species is created. The majority of vampires reproduce through infecting a human with the demonic energy in their bodies, which, over time, causes a human to transform into a similar demonic creature. Different vampires can infect humans in a number of different ways, through a bite, a drop of blood, making a human consume their blood, etc. Sometimes the human can still be alive whilst this process happens, other times they are dead, but the result is always the same. In the case of a savage vampire, the demonic energy quickly grows into a demon that ejects the soul from the body. The soul, as seen with ghosts, is where everything we are comes from, our minds, memories, etc. Savage vampires, therefore, are not people at all, but simply a demon occupying a human body, which in turn has been transformed into a demonic body. They are generally as single-minded as animals, and have no desire but to kill and torture their victims. They are among the strongest and most feared vampire breeds, with the likes of the dreaded Jianxi belonging to the savage vampires. Pure vampires, meanwhile, are when the demonic energy transforms the human soul into a demonic one. They are still the people they once were, technically, but all positive emotions such as love, compassion, remorse, and empathy are extinguished from the soul once it is transformed into a demon, and not only is a killer instinct added, but any negative emotions and traits the person had in life are also amplified too. These can be traits the person was aware of, or darker urges that were buried deep in their subconscious. Either way, pure vampires, in many respects, can be seen as twisted demonic caricatures of the people they once were. They embody the darkest side of humanity and of demon kind. Castran, the creator of all vampires, was quite possibly the most evil creature in all of creation. Pure vampires are also by far the most common. They consist of roughly 95% of all known breeds. Born vampires, meanwhile, are the rarest, but also the most powerful and evil. As their name suggests, they are the children of 2 vampires, and were never human. Only a very few species of vampires are capable of having children, and all are pure vampires. Born vampires also, unlike other breeds, do age, at least at first. They will start out as children and mature over the course of at least a century, though it may take longer in some cases. Born vampires not only possess greater strength, but a number of other great powers, and both before and after the Age of Teros, they were usually ranked first in any kind of vampire hierarchy, with many believing the Emperor to have been a born vampire at first. Unlike all other breeds, born vampires are not capable of infecting or transforming someone into a member of their kind. At the bottom of the vampire hierarchy, meanwhile, are the soul vampires. These bloodsuckers are created when the demonic energy grows into a demon inside the human's body, when they are either dead or alive. The demon, however, does not cast the soul out. Instead, it keeps it there, and continues to allow the soul to control the reanimated, now demonic body. The demon, however, does still influence the human soul. Not only does it add the killer instinct, but it suppresses all positive emotions such as love, compassion, remorse, guilt, empathy, and, just like with pure vampires, it heightens any negative qualities a person has in life, either conscious or unconscious. The difference between soul and pure vampires, however, is that it is theoretically possible for a soul vampire to fight the demon's influence. As the human soul still exists, its capacity for love, compassion, and remorse is still there, just trapped under the demon, unlike in pure vampires, where the human soul has now become a demon soul. It is exceedingly rare, but there have been a few documented cases of soul vampires fighting their demonic urges and rediscovering their humanity. As a result of this, and the fact that they were generally the weakest vampires, the soul breeds were looked down on by the others and are only ever used as foot soldiers in any vampiric society or organisation. Ironically, however, Jakarian was a soul vampire, though again he was the exception in terms of his high rank. Even with this knowledge, however, it still took Dionne quite a while to trust the reformed vampire, something she later told me she deeply regretted. Still, Carlene understood, as she had more than enough experience of people treating her differently, and in time she and Dionne came to be best friends, bonding largely over their shared love of soul music, and gradually Dionne was able to put at least some of the pain from her last years in Teiros and the death of Trian, as well as her regrets over how she had treated his family, behind her. Dionne went on many adventures with the circus family. Surprisingly, though, she didn't share many of them with me. I think that, unlike Teiros, however, she felt she didn't need to, as they didn't have the same traumatic impact on her. That's not to say that they weren't dangerous and scary at times, but still, unlike in Teiros, Dionne now had an entire family of people to help her. She spent, from her perspective, 5 years with the circus family. During that time, she travelled to hundreds of different planets, and even a few new universes too. She also fought the Hylexans many times. These octopoid monsters were the most recurring adversaries of the entire circus family, with all of the circus masters having faced them at certain points. Dionne later told me that she couldn't help but feel more than a bit satisfied at giving some back to the monsters who created the nightmarish world she had found herself trapped in. Dionne first met Jakarian from his perspective, ironically, when he was helping humanity against the Hylexans. She found it hard to conceal her hatred from him at first, and was even forced to help save his life from a Hylexan scout party, which was probably more painful than anything she went through in the camp. Still, over the course of their first adventure together, whilst Dionne hated him right the way through, she nevertheless admitted to me that she saw a somewhat different side to Jakarian when the vampire unexpectedly returned the favour and later saved her from the Hylexan's commander. In doing so, Jakarian actually took a risk, pushing her out of the way of a blast that very nearly killed him. When Dionne later asked him why, he simply told her, "You saved my life. It's the least I could do." Her hatred was soon mixed in with guilt at being forced to leave him to his fate. She often wondered afterwards if perhaps she and the circus family had taken Jakarian with them and supported his attempts to get clean from blood, that he could have maybe ended up like Carlene. Obviously, she knew it was out of the question to attempt to change history in this way, but that still didn't stop her from feeling responsible. Carlene, however, didn't agree. She reminded Dionne when she was first turned, she literally had no one to support her. She couldn't go back to her family and her boyfriend. The vampires regarded her as a freak and traitor. The only support Carlene had to begin with was Detective Cushing, but even he was sceptical of a vampire being anything other than a monster. Furthermore, Jakarian's evil had arguably eclipsed that of even his fellow vampires, in betraying his entire planet out of nothing more than spite. Whilst Carlene wasn't completely unsympathetic, she also did not think that Jakarian's evil was entirely down to what he was. Dionne herself would get a nasty reminder of how cruel the future vampire king could be in her second meeting with him as part of the circus family. By this stage, Jakarian was working with the Hylexans, and he used his former experience with the circus family to lure them into a trap for their old enemies. Dionne was so overcome with rage at having been tricked by him again, and having been stupid enough to feel sympathy for him at one point, that she very nearly ripped the vampire apart when she got free of the Hylexans. Over the course of her adventures with the circus, Dionne's powers had slowly begun to resurface. They still never got to the point that they were when she, later, from his perspective, killed Jakarian, but she was nevertheless able to control them to a greater extent than ever she could before. That is, except for this moment when the anger and hatred she felt was so great she almost ripped the vampire's body to pieces, not caring about the effects on history. Fortunately, Tarkan stopped her just in time, though Jakarian would remain terrified of Dionne for many years after. This also explained why he was so desperate to make her suffer in the camps years later, and also why he did not simply kill her, as even he would not dare change history. Dionne's attempt on Jakarian's life drove a wedge between her and Tarkan, who for a long while afterwards found it difficult to trust her not to interfere in established events. Eventually, however, Dionne would get a chance to prove herself, when the tent took the circus family back to Teros, many years after the war between the vampires and the humans was over.